In 2020, several large companies announced that they would be letting their workforces work remotely, permanently. Millions of teams through the pandemic had proven that they could work in that manner without major business disruption. I had already been down the path of loving remote work myself, and as these large companies started to make these announcements, I was 100% on board advocating for remote work. But then in September, Reed Hastings of Netflix announced that he expected his employees to be back in the office 12 hours after a vaccine for COVID-19 was available. I was torn. I love Hastings and his business philosophies. I was left wondering, how much does space proximity matter when it comes to getting work done, particularly office work and knowledge work? So I went on a mental journey. I started with 3 early examples that shaped my perspective. The first is the Orchid Lane crew. I live in a small town in Minnesota, and down the street, we have 3 families that live next door to each other. One wintry, sled-worthy day, these families posted pictures on Instagram of them sledding with each other. They were laughing, their kids were playing. They were the Orchid Lane crew, as they had posted in their tagline. My wife and I looked at it and we thought, man, we didn't make the cut. We're not in the crew. We never got an invite. I had made 2 assumptions. I went down the path of, they do not like us. We do not fit with their personalities. We are from the East Coast and we are not Minnesotan. And I went down another path and I thought, we live an 1/8 of a mile away. That 1/8 of a mile was enough distance to lose information flow. And because the information wasn't flowing, we didn't make the crew, we didn't get the invite. Even though emotionally it felt like that first path was the one we wanted to cringe down, it was more likely that the distance, however small, was really the driver of not making the Orchid Lane crew. Space proximity was a huge driver here. The second thing that shaped my early perspective was cities. On an episode of Econ Talk, Russ Roberts and his guest had been talking about the serendipity of cities and what it can drive. When you step out onto the city street, the feeling that anything can happen overwhelms you. You feel like you can meet your next job opportunity. You feel like you can meet the love of your life. You feel like you can meet your partner that you're about to start your next business with. The serendipity of cities is similar to working in an office, because you never know who you're going to run into. Of course, you sit close with your team, but there are people all over the office that when you go to the bathroom or when you go to lunch, you could run into them and start your next innovative problem-solving solution when you run into them. Finally, if you've ever been to New York City, you may be familiar with Arthur Avenue. Arthur Avenue is a neighborhood in the North Bronx that is known for its great Italian food. There is an economic phenomenon where businesses of similar industries cluster together, and they are taking advantage of the reputation of the geographic location. So in Arthur Avenue's situation, if you open an Italian restaurant there, immediately you have reputation. You are a good Italian restaurant, until of course you prove everybody wrong. In the office, a team member feels immediately connected with their team because they are in the same physical proximity. And this is a third case that shaped my early perspective that space proximity does indeed matter. Now, at this point, I thought Reed Hastings has something here. I was already enamored by his prior business philosophies. He's probably in the right here as well. Maybe people should be co-located. Maybe we should be in the same spot. Maybe I have to go back to the office. But space proximity is only one type of proximity. By definition, proximity is nearness in space, but also in time or relationship. So I started wondering, maybe space proximity and optimizing for space proximity is how we did work before, and optimizing for time or relationship proximity is what drives modern business performance. 41% of US workers, that's about 63 million people, work in an office. Through the pandemic, these people and teams have been able to experiment with taking more control of their behaviors. They've gotten to choose where to work, to an extent who to work with, to an extent when to work. They've been able to drive more of their life and take control of more of their life than they had in the past when they were tied to an office environment. Now, Dan Pink in his book Drive says that when institutions, whether it's a firm or a family or a government or a school, try to control the behaviors of the people in their congregation or their business, they do considerable long-term damage. This made me believe that remote work and letting your employees work remotely is a long-term strategy that can optimize for time and relationship proximity over space proximity. In my mental journey, I'd come full circle. 100% advocating for remote work, and then going back on that and thinking the office is the place where we need to be, as I sided with Hastings, and then going deep into thought about it, I reversed and have come back to 100% remote work. I'm advocating for 100% remote work. Admittedly, a few challenges arise. First, Shane Parrish of Farnham Street once posted, "Trust can't happen without time." A simple toy model can make this clear. If we start with a few assumptions that in an office, the average number of interactions you have with your team or the people you work around is 10. On the other hand, in a virtual environment, the number of interactions you have with your teammates or the people at your company is 2. That it's clear that is many more interactions in the office environment just by being in the same space proximity than in the virtual environment. If we assume that an employee is in role for, on average, 3 years, then we can use those interactions in that average time in role to understand what happens and how fast trust can get built. If we assume that trust in an office gets built in 6 months because you're interacting so frequently, we can use the same math to understand how long that would take in a remote environment. And in a remote environment, it takes obviously much longer. In this toy model, it takes 2.5 years, which is close to the time and role of an employee. By the time you've built trust with each other and your teammates, you're already ready for your next role. This is super important because trust is going to help us facilitate information flow, and it's also going to help us problem solve at a much faster rate. That's a big challenge. The second big challenge that's immediately clear is that when you have team members in different time zones across the country, or when you have team members in time zones across the world, it makes it very challenging to schedule meetings with each other, especially if you're located across the world. Effectively, time zone synchronization implodes. You will end up being on the phone 24 out of 24 hours of your day, and so will your team. You will run out of energy, you will become exhausted, and you will become burnt out. So with that challenge, we can't necessarily say, these are all the things we've done in the office when we were in the office, and now we're going to go remote, we're going to go virtual. The only thing we're going to change is our location, and we're going to do everything else the same. That simply will not work. And what businesses are thinking right now is that we should work remotely like we did here. But that's the wrong approach. What we need to do is start with a mentality not of the office and what we did in the office, but a mentality like this. When we start thinking about this, we need to start with a blank whiteboard. We need to start from scratch. Imagine your team, imagine your company, and it's day one. There's no option. You are remote. You are geographically separated. Start with that. And then figure out how you can optimize for both time and relationship proximity, not space proximity. If you start there, you start to think of new ideas. Here are a few that may come to your mind. First, The concept of blending helps us take multiple objectives and put those together in a way that allows us to solve for those objectives at the same time. For example, I had a coach a few years ago that said, instead of trying to improve your core work, core being physical health, making sure I'm strong, preventing physical injury, instead of taking that as a single objective and your other single objective of spending more time with your kids, you need to figure out ways to blend those together. My coach recommended, how about you lift your daughter over your head 20 times a day? How about every time you go to the playground, you do 10 pull-ups? And it was the first time in my life that I stuck with core work. I took two objectives that were very valuable to me. I blended them together, and by blending them together, I was able to stick with them. Now, if we think about the virtual or remote workforce, particularly if you are on or you lead a data team, one idea that comes to mind is if everyone collected data from their geographic location, whether that's population statistics, statistics on transportation, or statistics on the education level, you could start to bring those together as a team and look at those statistics and understand Joe, who works in New York, versus Mitchell, who works in Florida, versus Sydney, who works in Texas, and start to understand and analyze those community metrics, which are from geographically separated parts of the country or world, and then start to think, how do we use this information to solve problems? So you're doing two things at the same time. One, you're learning about the geography of the people that you work with, and number two, you're learning how to better use data to think about the world. You're blending two objectives. The second idea that may come to mind is that we lose the ability to randomly collide with people if we do not have the office environment. And we had said that colliding with people, particularly randomly, could drive innovation and advanced problem solving. But if we don't have an office to do that in, how are we going to make those random collisions? One way to think about it is this idea of speed dating. Connecting a dozen people with each other on a regular basis, a weekly, a monthly, a quarterly basis, where you run all sets of people and they talk to each other for 10 minutes. It could be very random, and it can be all the way from VP level down to entry level analyst, colliding with each other, sharing information, flowing information, and getting a sense of who's out there. Right? These 10-minute sessions can really open your eyes to who you want to work with and what problems you want to solve for either your team or the company. So you can replicate that random collision, and you can do it virtually. Finally, whenever we talk about remote work, the notion of loneliness often comes up. It is hard to not be able to formulate the friendships that you did in the office. And people talk about the fact that, simply put, they're lonely. I think there's a huge opportunity here to take advantage of performance coaches, to work with individuals and work with teams to help them spend more of their day in a flow state. Flow state, of course, being that place where you are challenged, but not too challenged that you're overwhelmed. Folks that spend time in a flow state often report higher levels of happiness and higher levels of joy in their work. If performance coaches can help individuals and teams spend more of their day, especially if they're virtual, in those states, it is a winning solution and solution for the problem of loneliness in the virtual environment. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a disaster. It has been hard for millions and millions of people across the world. However, it's also provided us an opportunity to rethink the way we work. It's an opportunity to rethink how work gets done. And if we can do that, I believe that we could advance not only our productivity, but also the mental health and well-being of individuals across the world. Thank you.